Hello, everyone. So I'm Yoann Lopes, software engineer at the Qt company. I've been in a company, well, actually not this company, but working for Qt for quite a long time. Maybe some of you already know me. It's been almost 10 years working for Qt. So I joined when it was still Nokia. Then I've seen different companies, Digia, then the Qt company. I've been working for most of this time in R&D. I was in Oslo, in our Oslo office, working on mostly graphics-related things, and then later multimedia, for which I was a maintainer. But in the last couple of years, I changed to a fairly, I took a different turn, let's say, and working more together closely with sales now as a pre-sales engineer, and I'm based in Paris. So today, I want to cover, I would say, one of the new things we've added recently in the Qt offering, and that is the design studio, or let's say more in general, our design offering, because as you might know already, we have the two new tools, the design studio then, and the 3D studio. And one question I often get is, I think people already quite imagine, for the people who don't know how it works, is what you can do with it, what it is for. But I think the question I almost always get is, how does it work in its entirety? How do you go from a design to something that actually works? So this is what I want to show you today, is to show you the full workflow, or at least one possible workflow from design to runnable code. So first, as an introduction, a few words about what we have already in Qt to help you doing faster iteration when it comes to design, or at least user interface, and that is Qt Quick. I assume most of you already know Qt Quick, and one of the main benefits of Qt Quick is it's basically how it allows you to do this fast iteration when it comes to doing GUI development. But as I just said, this is just about development. There's one component which is missing from this picture, is the design. How do you actually incorporate the actual design, which is usually done by different people than the developers? So this is why we wanted to extend the Qt Quick technology with something else, which is for different people, usually, and that is design tools. So let's look first, what is the problem today with how people work when they need to incorporate a design inside an application or developing an application. So this is typically how many companies and many people work. This applies mainly to, I would say, embedded products, not so much for desktop application, but I think it can apply as well. So basically, you're going to have a head of the development, you're going to have designers who are going to do design on typical design tools like Photoshop, or Sketch, or basically, I even seen PowerPoints used for doing a UI mockups. And then they will give that to an interaction designer, which will add all the different flows and transition and so on. And then later on, it will exchange different kind of files to a developer that will try to basically replicate what the designers have done. And eventually, you will be able to run that somewhere on the embedded hardware or maybe on desktop. So what's the problem with this workflow? There are actually many. So the first one is that you cannot, or at least it's quite difficult and costly, to test and validate the design at the prototyping phase. Because as I said, designers are using tools which are not runtimes. They're not tools to run software. So it's not possible to validate a design on hardware early on. Then also, you cannot usually reuse either prototypes for future prototypes from what you have done, but also you cannot really reuse anything in the development phase. So you will need to redo everything from scratch. And talking about that, not only you cannot reuse anything, but you will spend a significant amount of time trying to replicate, like in a pixel perfect way, the exact design. And finally, something which is usually quite difficult is doing animation. So for a bit more modern designs, usually you get a video from designers, and developers try to do exactly the same thing as it's shown on the video. This is usually very difficult for developers. Maybe you have done that, to come up with the exact same animation. So this is why at the Qt company we have added new tools, as I said earlier, to try to make this process a bit easier, both for designers but also for developers. And how? How do you do that? Well, by having a common set of tools, basically, so that both designers and developers work with the same framework and the same tools, so there's no loss of information or even, well, you can actually reuse assets in between. What are the benefits of that? Well, first of all, it's directly related to what I showed you just before. The first one is that since the designers are actually going to use Qt, whatever they do with the design tool, they can already run it and test it directly on the target system. That can be a PC, but it can be also an embedded board. That also means that you can, straight from the beginning, create components, not just images and so on, but actual components that will be reusable for future designs or directly by the developers, which means that, of course, you save a lot of time basically reusing this instead of redoing everything from scratch when you start the development. And you also get easier, and this is part of the tool, which I will show later. It's much easier to basically do animations because designers will use the Qt animation system, which will be then used directly by the developers, and they don't need to try to figure out how to do it exactly the same way. So what are these tools? I already mentioned them at the beginning. These are the Design Studio and the 3D Studio. And these come in addition to something that I guess most of you have already used. Most Qt developers are using Qt Creator as the development environment. So this is not changing. This is still here. It's still, I would say, the environment for developers for coding, for debugging, for analyzing, and even doing some user interface. And we've added two separate tools. Why we did that? Simply because, as I said earlier, it's for different people. It's not really meant to be for developers. So Qt Creator basically is just too, I would say, not complex, but it's too different from what designers are used to. So we cannot realistically impose this tool to designers. So this is why we created different ones which are closer to what they are used to. Of course, as a developer, you can also use this if you want to. But again, it's just the reason why they are separate. And what you get out of these tools are basically assets that you can directly reuse as a developer. So for example, if we take the Design Studio produces directly QML that you can then reuse in your project. So what are the key benefits of this approach? Well, there are different ones here, but I would say that the main ones, so the first one is the ability to basically test your prototype or your design directly on target from the beginning. I mean, this, in the end, reduces a lot of the risks of ending up doing a design which will not run correctly on an embedded system, for example. Then it's also so really validating basically the design. It's the second point in the middle. And also the other very important point is reusability, really. Reusability in the design and reusability between designers and developers. So in the end, it's about saving time and therefore saving costs as well. So enough slides. This is not really what I wanted to do in this presentation. I want to show you mainly how does it actually work. So I will move to the actual tools. I'll do a duplicate of my screen. If it's working. Okay. So what I have here is some fairly simple UI design in 2D. I'm going to make it a bit smaller so you can see all of it, which in this case is automotive kind of UI, so showing like a dashboard. And this has been done basically by one of our designers at a Qt company. It's, as I said, very simple, but again, the point is now I'm going to go through all the steps on how you can go from this to an actual Qt application running with C++ and so on. So as with any visual design, this is completely static. There's absolutely no interaction here, no transition, no screens, no anything like that. But there's one thing which is important to work with Qt Design Studio later on. It's components. And this is a key element on how you can work with design tools and Qt Design Studio, is that you already need to incorporate the notion of components in the design tools to be able to make something out of it in the Design Studio. So here, as you can see in this, I don't know if you're familiar with Design Studio, with Photoshop, sorry, but here we have I would say the content of this file, which is all the layers and all the different things there is in this Photoshop file. And what's important is to see that there are multiple groups, and in each group there are potentially multiple layers, not this one, but for example this one, which has some kind of background and some text. And what that means is that every group that you see here will become a Qt component, will actually become a Qt source file. So which is why it's important for the designer to already respect these kind of guidelines to get something usable in the end. And so once you have done that, I mean, in this case, just to give some examples, you can see that the speed dial is one component, the RPM dial is another component, and so on. So what you can do from this is that then you need to export this for the Design Studio. So you have this plugin, which is called the Qt Bridge. This is what you can see here. It seems like there's some issue with it. It's not showing up correctly. Okay, here it is. So this is the Qt Bridge for Photoshop. So you cannot directly import a Photoshop file inside Qt Design Studio. You first need to go through this initial step, which is just about exporting the different assets. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but the main thing that you need to do is to set the directory where you're going to export all your assets. And then there are a few things that you can do here, and this is directly related to QML. So basically, for each component which I have in my Photoshop file, I can tell, for example, if I select, just have to find it, it's in the speed dial, and I select this component, the arc, the blue arc, then I can tell for each component how I want to export this inside QML. What should it be? Because Photoshop knows only about 3 types of items. It's either image, text, or just generic components, basically. And it cannot be anything else than that. So by the way, any text layer in Photoshop will be automatically converted to a text item in Qt Quick. Every layer will become an image, and every group will become an item, an empty item. So it's just a layout item. But I can also tell that it should be something else. And in this case, this is one example. It's the arc here, the blue arc. This should not be an image because I want to animate the arc to follow the speed. So it should be an actual arc and not an image. So this is why I tell here that this object should be the QML type arc item, which is a specific type to Studio, Qt Design Studio, sorry. And then I can already set some kind of properties here, which are QML properties to tell how the object should be declared. So as you can see, this is somewhat, I mean, you do need to have an understanding of how QML works to be able to set these properties. But this is purely, I mean, entirely optional. You don't need to set these for this to work. I just said if you don't, then it will be everything, either text, image, or items. But if the designers have some understanding of Qt Quick and QML, it can already do this. So then let's just basically export all of this. So I'm just going to click the export button. It's going to export all the images for each layer, and it will also generate a special metadata file which contains basically information to generate QML from that. So this is the directory where it's doing the export. So you see that all the PNGs are being created with different assets. And the last thing that it will do is creating that special metadata file. It's going to take a while, so I mean, at least a minute. So I'm going to go now in Qt Design Studio, which is here, which for the ones who haven't seen it yet looks very similar to Qt Creator. And that's for one good reason, is because it's actually Qt Creator with stuff removed so that it's a bit easier and lighter than Qt Creator, basically. And we're going to create a new project, which is going to be just an empty Qt Quick application, which we're going to put in here. We're going to call it dashboard design. Sorry, that's not the... I'm going to let all the default, actually I'm going to change this even though it's not very important. Otherwise I'm just going to let all the different parameters by default. So a bit like in Qt Creator, basically the wizard is going to create a default project with different files, which we do not really care about in this example. So there's a default screen which has been created here, but I don't want actually to use that. What I want is to import what I did in Photoshop. So now the export is done. I have all my assets here. And I'm going to import all of this in Qt Design Studio. So I have my project open. I'm going into this resource tab here. Before I actually do that, just a word on the layout of all this. You might also recognize this. This looks very similar. Actually, it looks almost exactly the same to the Qt Quick Designer that we have in Qt Creator, because again, it is actually the same thing, with some extra features, which I'm going to show you exactly what these are. So, as I said, I'm going into the resource tab here, and I'm going to add new resources. I'm going to go into the folder where I exported my design, and I'm going to just not select everything, but just that special metadata file that I said. So I just open that. And here you have a few options today. You can basically tell if you want to import only the QML part, only the assets, the image assets, or both. And in the case where you having an iterative approach and that you're re-importing things over and over again, there's a merge, you see here, functionality, so that you don't actually lose whatever you have done in the Design Studio. So right now, I do not need to merge because it's the first time I'm importing. So I'm going to do that. So this is when it's actually creating all the QML files. So for each component which was declared in Photoshop, there's a corresponding or a matching QML file, which basically get the name. You see, this is, for example, one name of a file, which was set in Photoshop here. So by default, it just gives some like automatic name to it with some IDs and so on, because the ID must be unique. But if you want, you can replace it. So now the import is done. And you can see that I have the list of all my assets here. And if I go into the project view, you can see now I have all my QML files. And if I directly open the main one, which is this one, the cluster art.qml, you can see that it's a bit smaller resolution, so it's not easy to show everything at once, but anyway. You see we have our all screen with everything in it, and these are already components and they are already QML. We're not hiding the QML, you can see it here, and you can see that it's already fully workable, working QML, and I can already actually start this directly, and it's already, I mean, this is actually QML code being run on my machine. So I didn't have to reproduce exactly the same layout by hand to replicate this. So it's just a bit big for this resolution, but it should be fine. So once you have done that, obviously you're not done. I mean, this is still a static design. It's runnable code, but it's still static. And what we want to do is to add animations, we want to add transitions, we want to bind this to real values and so on. So let's start with animations. So let's say I want to, let's take something simple, which is not going to take too much time. Let's animate the needle in the middle, the blue needle here, so that it changes based on the speed. And we will also change the arc so that it follows the needle. So this is something now that you can do easily with Qt Design Studio. This was somewhat difficult with Qt Quick Designer because there was no way to define animations easily. You had to program it, basically. And this was a lot of trial and error to be able to do it right. So this is why we added the new timeline feature, which is what you have here, which lets you define keyframes, and then it automatically interpolates between different keyframes. So before I do that, I'm actually going to do inside this component, because this is what I want to modify. So I'm going to the speed needle component. I'm going to change the background color so it's a bit more visible. And I'm actually going to fix something, because this is the arc item which we exported from Photoshop. We told this should be an arc item, but there's an issue with the size, so I need to fix it manually. Now it should be fine. And, well, apparently I cannot resize this. It's okay. So I'm going to create the timeline, which is here. And for those who are not familiar with what that is, again, I briefly explained, but it's basically a representation of how your object should behave through time, basically, by defining key points, by defining the key value, the different steps of the changes. So I'm just going to leave everything by default. I'm just going to remove the actual animation. So it will be a timeline with 1,000 different frames. And I'm going to basically create 2 keyframes. I want to define where is the needle at the beginning and where it is at the end, so at 0 and 200. So I'm going to position my time needle here to the beginning, so the first frame, and I'm just going to put the needle at the beginning. So for that, actually, to make this a bit easier, I'm going to kind of use a trick, not to actually animate the needle, but I'm going to add, by the way, here you have all the libraries of the QML items. You have access to all the same QML items you have otherwise available in regular Qt Creator. And I'm going to add an item in the center of my screen. And I'm going to put the needle as a child of this empty dummy item, so that now I can just simply rotate the empty object, and that's how I get the rotation of my needle in relation to the center of this component. So as I said, I position here my frame to the first one. I'm going to start recording keyframes, and I'm going to select my element here, and I will change the rotation. So I think it should be this value, the correct one. I'm kind of cheating here because I knew what it should be. So you see now that my needle is at 0. It should have created a keyframe. So you see this is my keyframe at frame 0. And at frame 1000, the last one, now I want my rotation to be, I believe, if I remember correctly, 92, yes. So it created another keyframe. So now I can stop recording keyframes. And now, basically, QtDay will simply interpolate between the 2 positions. And I'm going to do the same thing with the arc. So the arc item, which is, by the way, something specific to the Design Studio. This is not part of Qt Quick in general. It only exists within Qt Design Studio. And I'm going to insert a keyframe. So basically, the end of my arc at frame 0 should be the same as the beginning, so it should be minus 60. And at the end, it should be, I'm not sure, I think it's, yep, 240. So now I have basically the behavior I wanted. As I go through the frames, I have my needles moving and the arc following it. And what I want So if I want just to try this, I don't have yet a value. I'm a designer. I don't know how to connect this to something real. So I just want to see all the possibilities. So I want to actually animate it. So I'm going to add an animation for that, a real animation. This is a timeline. It's not the same thing as an animation. And what I want also to do is to expose some property to the outside so that I can control this. So I'm going to select the root components, so my actual speed dial components, and I'm going to go here in the property pane, and I'm going to add a new speed property. I'm going to call it speed. It will be of type real, and I can let the default value to 0. So basically now my animation is going to be bound to this new property I just created, so that whenever I change the speed, my needle will move together with it. So how do I do that? For now, I would say this is a bit maybe not ideal, but I'm sure it will change in the future. For now, you have this binding field here, where you can tell what should be the current frame. You can bind like regular QML binding to tell what should be the current frame. And what I want is, now that I have this speed property, I want to be, I know that my maximum speed is 200. So it's the current speed divided by 200 times the number of frames, which is 1,000. So I just interpolate the current frame, and this is how now, whenever I change the speed, it will get the right needle position. And if I go back inside my main component, actually, I'm just going to do one other thing. I'm going to also bind the text, the speed text, to that value that I just, or property that I just created. And that you know that this is actually very easy to do in QML. I can just go inside the binding here, and I can add a binding. Actually, I don't even have to do it this way. I can just simply go into the text property here, and instead of setting this hard-coded 140, I can set a binding, and I know that it's the speed. That's my property that I created, but there should be an extra step. I want to round it because it's not an integer value, so I'm going to just do this. For those of you who do not know QML, this is one of the main, let's say, advantage of QML is that you can set this concept of binding. And whenever the property changes, the binding is automatically re-evaluated without you doing anything. Except that now I don't see the, okay, I'm going to do it this way. I think the window is too small now. This is a bug, so I cannot actually close the pop-up. Okay, no, it's fine. I'm going to center the text. Now I'm going back here, and as I said, I'm going to animate the needle based on an actual animation. So I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to create a timeline, which will have also 1,000 frames. But this time here, you see this is the timeline definition here, and this is the animation definition. As I said, this is two different things. And what this animation is going to do is that it's going to run continuously, and it's going to go from frame 0 to frame 1,000, and so on. Like go from 0 to 1,000 to 0 to 1,000, and so on. And animate this through time, and it's going to last 10 seconds. This is in milliseconds. I'm going to create two keyframes. So at the beginning, this component you see now has a speed property. That's the one I created just before. I will say that at the beginning it will be 0, and at the end it will be 200, so the maximum speed. You see the needle automatically position itself correctly. Actually, I just typed 2,000 instead of 200. Stop recording. And now if I launch this preview, the needle now should just animate. So this is how, as a designer, I can already see what are the different, I can test basically my UI to see all the different combinations. And I see also the text changing. A word on what you're seeing right now. So what you see right now, this is also one of the new features of the Design Studio. It's called the live preview. And its main feature is that even though I cannot show it easily now because I have only one screen, but whatever I do inside the Design Studio is reflected immediately here without relaunching anything. So, for example, I'm just going to make this smaller a bit. And I'm going to move this component here in the Design Studio here. And you will see that it immediately is reflected in the live preview. So on desktop, I would say this is not very useful. But when you're doing prototyping on embedded system, this is very useful because then you do know if you do that, that it's always very time consuming to recompile, redeploy, and so on. So with this, you save completely that time of not redeploying to the target device. So I'm basically done now with the Design Studio. It was very simple, but the point is not to do something complex. You have now somewhat interactive design, but it's not yet bound to a real value. And so now I'm moving to the other side of the workflow phase. Now, as a developer, I want to get this and to actually interface it with some real code. I have, let's say, a backend which is written in C++. This is how you should build your QtQuick application. You should not try to do everything in QML. You should write your backend in C++ and your front end in QML. So as a developer, I'm going to take care of the C++ backend. And in this case, let's say I've already done something, and it's a C++ backend, and I'm going to need to plug it to this. So how do I do this? As I said, the Design Studio is directly working with QML files. So this is our project here, and you see there's a bunch of QML files, and they are directly reusable. So as a developer, I'm just going to, as of today, there's no, I would say, automatic import and so on. I'm just going to basically copy and paste everything that's in here to my actual Qt Creator project. So I'm just selecting everything, going into this application, which is a Qt Creator project, going into the QML directory and pasting everything here. I can replace this. And if I go inside Qt Creator, I have this project here which was created beforehand, which for now is basically very simple. It's just a main.cpp, which loads an empty QML file with basically just a window, an empty window. So if I run it now as is, well, it's basically just an empty window, and I want to show what has been done in the Design Studio. So I just showed you I copied all this file in this project. So because in my Qt Creator project here, I basically simply said that I add as a resource of this project every QML file in the QML directory. This is what I do here. It should be all automatic. I don't need to manually add all these files. So I can just run qmake again and compile. And now all these QML files should be automatically embedded inside the binary. And what I can do is that now I can add my QML component to this window, which was called cluster arts, I think. There's some issue with the right now. It did recognize it. I'm going to make this component fill the whole window. And now, if I just run this as is, it's not right, because I forgot to do one thing. It's not enough. I mean, if you look at what has been created by the Design Studio, you will see that it's not just QML files. There's a bunch of folders here, which contain some extra stuff. I mean, there's the asset, which is all the PNG files. But more importantly, there's this directory here, which is the import directory, which contain, today this is how it's done, some additional modules, let's say. For example, you saw that I used some arc item. I said this is not part of QML. For now, how it does is that it puts that inside the project. It's like a small library what you have to get with your project. So you need to tell the QML runtime to also look for a new place for additional modules. So this is what I'm going to do in the main.cpp, and it's basically just one line of code. I just call on the QML engine. I'm going to tell that I want to add an import path to look for additional modules. And this is going to be inside the resource path of my application. And that should be just like this. So the import directory inside QML, inside the resource system. And now, oops, I forgot to put the semicolon. It should just show my design running now in a real C++ application. But as I said, this was not the point. The point was to actually connect to some real value. So as you can see here, I already written, that was not the point to show how this is done, but a backend, a C++ backend, which use one of the new modules we added recently in Qt, which is called Qt Remote Object. And so, again, I'm not going to show how it's done, but I created basically an Android application, which is very simple. You probably cannot see it here, but it's just a slider on my Android phone, which actually will be the speed. And what I want is that whenever I change the slider here, it will update the speed on my needle, in my UI. So basically, this is the code. It's very simple. It uses that remote object module, connect to the IP of my phone, carry for an object which is called backend, and whenever that object emits the speed change signal, it will basically update a property here which is called speed as well. And in my main.cpp, you see that I actually instantiated this backend object, and I inserted it inside the context. So if you have never, again, used QML, this is one simple way to incorporate C++ object inside QML. You just get the reference or the address of the object, you put it inside the QML context, and you give it a name. So in this case, I will have this C++ backend reference or named as backend. So I go inside my now QML file. I'm going to go actually in this component directly, the cluster art. I don't want to do this. I don't want to edit the code. And now I don't care anymore about the actual animation. I don't want to animate it. I want to follow that value. So I'm going to remove all that timeline code, which I do not care about. Just delete this stuff. And this speed dial, which comes directly from Design Studio, we do know now that it has a speed property. And I just basically need to bind it to the object that I created in C++. So it's going to be the backend dot speed. This is the property that I created inside this backend. So now if I rerun again this application, and I open my Android application, hopefully it should, yeah, it actually works. So, of course, this was a very simple example. I mean, it's very minimal, but hopefully it gave you a better idea of how you go, as I said, from a static design to something that is a real Qt application, which connects your QML design to your real logic, basically. There are basically this tool that I just showed you, the Design Studio. This is very recent. This was released back in December last year, December 2018. So I would say that it's still, honestly, a bit rough around the edges at this point. There's been the first patch release, or like feature release 1.1, which was released back in February this year, which already improves a lot of stability issues and bugs and so on. But there's going to be new version released every quarter. So there's the next one coming later this year, and another one by the end of the year, which will all improve different things. So I'm not going to detail now all the new things we're going to add to this tool. I will have tomorrow at 9 o'clock a roadmap presentation where, among other things, I will explain you what we're adding to this tool as well to some other tools. I just wanted also quickly, before we go and move on to questions, have a few words about the 3D Studio, because I focused all the presentation on Design Studio, but basically 3D Studio is more or less the same thing. It's a different tool for doing different things, but the workflow that I described is very similar with the 3D Studio. It's just for, again, doing different things. 3D Studio is about doing 3D, but the workflow is the same. You get the ability to import assets from popular 3D creation tools like Maya, like 3ds Max or others. You import that inside 3D Studio. You use 3D Studio to do animations, transitions, screens, and so on. And then you can put what you've done in this tool directly inside Qt Creator in a real C++ project, and you do this kind of binding in a very similar way. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's very similar. So again, very similar workflow. For now, it's two different tools, but eventually we want to make these two tools the same. I will talk a bit more about this also in the roadmap tomorrow. So now I think we have some time for questions, if any.
Perfect timing.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you, Yoann. So, any question? Please hands up. Don't be shy. Yeah.
For the part of exporting assets from Photoshop, do you need a plugin or?
So from Photoshop to Design Studio?
To Design Studio.
Yeah, this is what I showed you in the beginning. In the Photoshop, you need to install a separate plugin for Photoshop to be able to export. Without that, no, you cannot really do anything. So it's a kind of two-step export. It's first you export from Photoshop with that plugin, and then you import inside Design Studio. Yeah.
Any other question?
One question, can you resize the window or it's only static for the moment?
So this is a good question. It's a bit, it's possible to do, let's say, responsive design with the Design Studio, but it's, I guess, not going to be so, I would say it's very easy to do fixed size designs because, of course, Photoshop doesn't know about this. You usually do something in one fixed resolution, and if you import it as is, it will be also fixed resolution. So now, if as you saw, actually, I was in fact resizing the window, and you saw that it was not resizing. So by default, this is what you will get. You will get a fixed size project or fixed size UI. And if you want to have it like dynamic in the sense that it adapts to different resolution and so on, as a developer, you would need to rework on the design, at least for as of now, how it works, to use basically relative positioning rather than fixed or pixel-based layout. Because again, from Photoshop, that's all you can do. You can only do, well, actually we could do something, I guess, differently, but at least that's how it works today. It creates pixel-based layout from that. So if you want to go to, again, as I said, something resizable, you would need to remove all the fixed size layout and use either anchors or actual layout. But so it would be, I would say, somewhat significant work for the developer to transform it to something resizable. So again, today it's not automatic. You're not going to get automatically a resizable layout.
Okay, you partially respond to my question because in my understanding, the designer has quite huge work to do because it has to have a minimum understanding of QML, for example, because you have to structure things in a proper way, like items, groups, layers, and so on, place these, and the layout must be pixel perfect, let's say. I mean, you must place items in the proper place, and the layout is quite fixed. Is it correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's true that it requires some work on the design side to work with this, but I believe that, so the QML side, I mean, what I showed you where the designer put it himself, these different values, this is, as I said, optional. It doesn't need to do it. But the decomposition of the objects, yes, that's just mandatory. There's no other way around it. So there's some maybe learning curve for the designer as well if he's not used to decompose his project in different components. But I believe that anyway, nowadays most designers work this way anyway. To some extent they do have different levels, different layers and so on. So I think it's not, I would say, too much to ask. Designers are smart as well. I think the concept of component is not that difficult to grasp. However, I do understand that learning QML to be able to set yourself different properties, that's another level. And I don't expect every designer to actually do that. So in this case, most likely then it would be the developer who would need to do that himself. Like for the arc, as I showed you, if the designer is not able to do that, the developer would need to himself tell, well, this is an arc and this is what should be the values.
The second question is about the merge QML, because let's say the changes must come upstream from the designer.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot, let's say, force the changes from QML to Photoshop.
Mm-hmm. No, you cannot go. It's only one way, basically. So as I showed you in Design Studio, you can merge new changes, but you cannot go the other way around. You cannot do some changes in Design Studio and somehow put that back into the PSD file. That's just not possible, at least not today. And I don't think it will ever, but yeah, it's just one way, from Photoshop to Design Studio. And by the way, on this, I showed only Photoshop today, but there will be more tools supported in the future. It's not just Photoshop.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other question? Okay, I think we're done. Okay, thank you very much, Yoann.
Thank you.
Thank you again.